Good afternoon. Today is the 14th of August 2024. We are 22 minutes past 1. Welcome to this special edition of UK Column News. Many of you will know we had to put out a news flash this morning to say that we were experiencing some problems. We weren't able to give you a live news, but we're delighted to be here to record the news. And obviously this will be appearing on the UK Column website in due course. So I am in part of the UK Column studio, a little bit that maybe you haven't seen before, and I'm delighted to have Vanessa Beeley and Charles Malet with me on video link. So let's do our best to take you through this news. And I'm going to kick off with talking about Ukraine. And this is, you're about to see a little video clip to do with the Ukrainian incursion into Russia. And this has been a major part of the headlines over the weekend, but all is not quite as simple as it seems. Let's have a little listen to this video clip.
This is war. As the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk hits a wall, the rest of the front line is still active. Ukrainian troops enjoyed a quick blitzkrieg into Russian Kursk, where Ukraine was able to take control of 11 settlements in pre-war Russian ground. But after the initial breakthrough, Ukrainian troops haven't achieved their tactical objective. Ukrainian allies are disappointed with the Ukrainian armed forces offensive in the Kursk region. The Ukrainian armed forces offensive in the Kursk border region has been stopped after the rapid redeployment of reserves and is turning into another meat grinder for the Ukrainian troops. The North Group has attracted units with combat experience to repel the attacks, rather than hastily assembled brigades with a 2-week training course, as is usually done in the Ukrainian armed forces.
So there you have it. Essentially, the Ukrainians crossed the border in the direction of Kursk, possibly up to about 15,000 troops moved in through that breach. And Western commentators at least have said that the objective of the Ukrainians was to go as far as they could towards Kursk, which has a nuclear power station facility. So if captured, this would be a big coup for the Ukrainians. But in reality, they didn't get anywhere near that facility before Russian reinforcements had come into the area and slowed down the Ukrainian advance considerably. Now, Zelensky's been claiming that the Ukrainians took about 1,000 square kilometers. Other observers are saying it was nearer to 500, but nevertheless, a significant amount of territory taken, but claims about 28 communities being taken by the Ukrainian forces. This is all overstatement because this is an area of minimal population and very, very tiny communities. Most of it is simply rural and wooded areas. But the BBC, as we can see on screen, made bigger this, if we just highlight some of this. So the BBC here with "We entered easily," say Ukrainian troops involved in the Russia incursion. Ukraine's incursion, where does it go from here? Ukraine claims to control 1,000 square kilometers. And an earlier article from Steve Rosenberg, Ukraine's incursion shows Russia war is not going to plan. But if we actually go to Ukraine itself for reports, things start to look very different. So here's the Kiev Post, all eyes on Kursk, but Donetsk in trouble, special forces source says. A little bit of a tongue twister, that one. The Russian army is advancing into the Donetsk region, heading towards the strategically important city of Pokrovsk. And if we have a look at some of the comments that go with this article, this is where it gets very interesting, because remember, this is a Ukrainian forces man speaking. While the Ukrainian army is making rapid progress in Russia's Kursk region, the Russian army has made significant gains at the Pokrovsk front in Ukraine's Donetsk region, and the situation is becoming dire. An individual from a special forces battalion told the Kiev Post. The city of Pokrovsk, the capital of the district of the same name, is a transport hub lying on the main road that's an important supply route to other Ukrainian outposts in the region. The source told Kiev Post on conditions of anonymity that Pokrovsk city and other settlements through the district, it's about 508 square miles as a total region, are under constant enemy airstrikes. That means Russian airstrikes where cluster bombs are being used. And the man goes on to say that Ukrainian defenders on the Pokrovsk front have been able to leave their positions for 90 days due to intense shelling and the use of strike drones. And they go on to say it's very difficult to deliver food, water, and ammunition to the positions due to the risk of artillery fire and loitering munitions. Resupply is done using unmanned aerial systems and ground-based remote-controlled drones. The source said that evacuation of the wounded is carried out by ground drones, and logistics and frontline surveillance are complicated due to the Russians' massive firepower. So this is very clear that on the main part of the fronts in the war in Ukraine, the Russians are causing huge problems for the Ukrainian. And it then says that a Ukrainian lieutenant with the call sign Alex on his Telegram channel on Tuesday reports that the situation is darkening. Everything is very grim on the Pokrovsk front. Without exaggeration, battles are emerging for Avdiivka within the village itself. And he goes on, the article goes on to say, as reported on the same day on Telegram by deep state analysts using satellite footage, Russian troops have occupied the villages of Lysychansk, Ivanivka, and Severodonivka. But essentially, what we're seeing is a massive advance by the Russians, which we need to understand because this is the important part of the battle, whilst the Western media is bigging up on the Ukrainian incursions in the Kursk area. Now, what's surprising about this report is that the Ukrainian source is actually now reverting to social media on Telegram and other places in order to report accurately what's happening on the battlefront. And if we have a look at the Kiev Post article itself, they also include this little clip which shows an animation of the Russian attack. Now, this might seem very small, but what we need to remember is this is just one of the many fronts on the Ukrainian battle lines themselves. And the important thing is that the Russians are advancing every day. It might be 200 meters, it could be 500 meters, it could be a kilometer, 7 kilometers, but it is happening each day on many regions in the front. And in many cases, Ukrainian defenses are collapsing. Meanwhile, we are being told that the Ukrainian incursion over the border and into Russia in direction of Kursk is the important attack, and this is incorrect. Meanwhile, we'll just have a look at these video clips showing the horrors of the battle and the front itself, where the Russians are using FAB strikes, they're using artillery, and of course they are using drones to attack Ukrainian positions across the front. Really horrific fighting on the main part of the battle lines. So the last video there showing Ukrainian armor being destroyed. Now, the Russians have suffered huge losses themselves, but at the end of the day, they are able to replace those losses, whereas the Ukrainians can't. Now, on screen, part of the horrors of life in Ukraine, because the recruitment squads, very brutal in lifting young and old from the streets and dragging them off to the front, where they're either going to die or be mutilated, unless they are very, very lucky, because this is a brutal war. And this is something that the BBC is not reporting, that within Ukrainian society, Ukrainians are now setting fire to the recruitment vehicles. Often these are of neighbours. Neighbours are part of the recruitment teams, and these vehicles are being set on fire in protest at the snatching of relatives to take them to the front. And we need to remember where this war has got, because even Trump is now talking about 500,000 dead. The majority of those casualties Ukrainian, probably in the ratio of 3-4 to 1. But I have seen on social media allegations that so much space is now being taken up for graves in Ukraine that this is causing problems with areas of land that have already been handed over to Western corporations for future development, or at least rebuilding of Ukraine. So absolutely horrific, the situation in Ukraine. UK, the US and the West are fomenting this war. And of course, if we dare to stand up and speak out about it, we're likely to come under, we're likely to get in trouble with the UK government, at least, due to the increasing censorship under Keir Starmer's new Labour regime. So really horrible things happening in this war in Ukraine. This is fomented by the West, the US and the UK in particular, pushing for this war. And we're now into 500,000 dead. But if you dare stand up and speak out about this, you're likely to come under the watchful eye of Keir Starmer's new Labour government. Charles, let's bring you in here, because you're looking at Dissent and really what the government is doing.
That's right, Brian. Yes, good afternoon all. Thanks very much for bearing with us. And the events of the last few weeks have certainly prompted the government and the police and the media to act in a very particular way. Some on certain sides of the debate or the argument might consider that this is a demonstration of the effect the state can have when it puts its mind to it. I think when one looks at detail, it looks like a sense of a complete loss of proportionality by police. The criminal justice system, on the one hand, can be seen to deliver an effect when called to, but is it the right effect? Is it appropriate? Or does it really look like it is the great big boot of authority stamping on dissenting voices? So we start with a tweet from the National Police Chiefs Council, NPCC, effectively showing off that they've arrested over 1,000 people and already charged over 500. So those prison spaces that we've talked about previously are now being vacated in order to move people in many cases on very, very tenuous and spurious grounds. But nonetheless, I've highlighted the text at the bottom of this, which says, "We told you justice would be swift and we wouldn't tolerate this type of criminality." Now, I think the two things that come out of there, first of all, are a rather menacing tone, which I think does not fit with the model that police really should be espousing to work towards, which is one of a cordial relationship with the public. Instead, it suggests a sort of bully boy mentality. And the other one, I think, to be drawn out of this is the specific reference to this type of criminality. And in effect, they're saying that, of course, they can, if they choose, deal with this or something else. But the inference being that there's plenty of stuff that they choose not to deal with. A constant gripe about policing and the political nature of it in this country. So we'll move on now to hear what Gavin Stevens, the chair of the NPC, said about this, talking about working hard to bring the disorder to an end. Arrests are just getting started, again, sort of slightly showing off, and they won't stop till communities get the justice they deserve. Well, that's a highly questionable statement, or indeed one that's very much open to interpretation. But the point he's trying to make here is he's linking violence and spreading of what he's calling online hate. And the NPCC has gone on to talk about regional crime units. If we just click on one, we see that they've got units set up specifically to deal with this. And the text in the next slide says that specialists have been tasked with pursuing online offenders and so-called influencers. Well, it's the media and the state that are calling them influencers and deciding that they are spreading hate and inciting violence. This is what I want to come on to. So next we'll look at the Serious Crime Act of 2007, which in effect amended the law with regard to incitement. There's a difference between inciting racial hatred, which of course is something that's cropped up a lot recently because that's covered by the Public Order Act 1986. Specifically here, we're talking about the Serious Crime Act, which defined two offences in sections 44 and 45. The first one being intentionally encouraging or assisting an offence. So and we need to consider what this is, and I'll explain why, because of how some people have in effect fallen foul of the law. But somebody commits this offence if they do an act capable of encouraging or assisting the commissioning of an offence, and also that the person intends to encourage or assist its commission. Very key phrase there, to intend that, and both things must happen for the offence to be complete. But then they go on to qualify it by saying that the offender is not to be taken to have intended to encourage or assist the commission of an offence merely because such encouragement or assistance was a foreseeable consequence. So that's section 44. The next slide is 45, which is slightly different in that the act is, again, capable of encouraging or assisting, but it's the belief that the offence will be committed and that the act will encourage the commission of such an offence. Now, related to this, we've had a couple of instances of people that are being referred to as certainly far right and online influencers and whatnot, one of whom was a woman in Cheshire, the other of whom is David Clues, who runs the Unity News network. And effectively, he has been what's called doxed. He's had several attacks from mainstream publications, which in a sense are, if they're taken on a reasonable basis and they do actually attack the point and not the man, fair enough. In this case, the specific references have been made to his family, which have had nothing to do with any of his online presence or his news broadcasting, and yet they have been dragged into this. So this is effectively the level that we've got to. And I'll just go on to explain why this is a huge problem. But first of all, just to look at what he's been described as doing here is fanning flames. But we'll just go on and have a look at his Twitter, or the UNN Twitter, over the last few days. First of all, we see that he's simply reporting that there's a presence out in Southport as anger expresses itself over the murder of 3 young children. And then the next one says that the Southport riots is effectively comparing the way that violence was treated by police in 2 different situations. And then finally, he's talking about effectively state violence here with a picture of Keir Starmer and Zelensky, saying that extreme violence, murdering and maiming of people is okay as long as the government does it. Now, the issue with Clues here is that these journalists can conduct this sort of activity with absolute impunity because of the gift that is the Online Safety Act 2023, which we look at in the next slide. And then we'll just go straight on to the provision in section 179, which states that a person commits an offence if they send a message and that it conveys information that the person knows to be false. Now, that is absolutely critical to this. Further, that the person intended the message or the information in it to cause non-trivial psychological or physical harm to a likely audience. Well, this means, in effect, this takes some of the provisions from the Malicious Communications Act 1988 and the Communications Act 2003 and rolls them up into this offence. But the most significant detail comes next in section 180, which says, in part 1, a recognised news publisher cannot commit an offence under section 179. So even if the article that was printed in the Sunday Times, the Daily Record and the Guardian, all attacking David Clues. So don't mean to make the point about the individual, but the fact is that they can do this because even if they knew the information was not false, and with Clues there was effectively a reference to sort of the suggestion of criminal activity, which was absolutely not borne out by the events of some years ago. But they not only have the intent of putting out false information, but to intend to cause harm. And yet there's no comeback because the Online Safety Act, which is exactly what we've been warning about for years, rules this out. So to look, if you want the background to all of this, I'd suggest that you go into the censored section on the UK Column website, which has a really in-depth analysis of the timeline for all of this. Now, concurrent with this, just updated yesterday, was the guidance on radicalisation and Prevent. We'll just have a look at the government website, updated 13th of August, how the Prevent programme supports people who are at risk of becoming involved with terrorism. So again, trying to capture everybody like within this, effectively within this sort of construct. And we'll just look quickly at the referral form itself. So I've asked concern or collaboration. I mean, there's a more than a whiff of 1930s Germany here, getting people to report on their family, friends and neighbours. But the referral itself, particularly in the next slide, has a number of phrases, talks about extremist groups or people that worry you, but of course doesn't qualify it. So essentially trying to push people into a situation of concern about others, travel plans to a conflict zone, and also the threatened anyone with violence, shown interest in hate crimes, extremists or terrorism, or use their mobile telephone, internet or social media in a way that worries you. Well, effectively, this is so absurdly subjective as to be almost meaningless. But the next slide will just go on to how effectively sort of ludicrous this has become in terms of putting the tail on the donkey. And we've got the Daily Mail here reporting that Tommy Robinson and Nigel Farage being considered or scrutinised by the security services amid fears that Putin is actually behind all this. So what the next slide shows just a little bit of text from this, saying that questions remain unanswered over who's financially supporting Robinson. Well, this was something we dealt with on UK Column News a few weeks ago. The Israel lobby very, very clearly stating that they have funded Robinson in the past. So I don't know why there'd be any debate or confusion over that. But then some looking to Putin, arguing he benefits from domestic unrest in Britain. Worth pointing out, of course, that Nigel Farage has come out very much as a taking a pro-Israel stance at the moment. And what we'll do now is we'll just have a look at the former Secret Intelligence Service MI6 operative Christopher Steele, who's speaking to a Times Radio journalist about his views on whether or not Russia has anything to do with this.
What happened in Southport? It caused such psychological, or was designed to cause such psychological damage, this attack, and it is obviously subject to a criminal investigation now, on children at a Taylor Swift dance party. Will they be looking, the security services, if you like, at one of those, at a jigsaw of what's been happening in this country, and will they be looking potentially for links between what happened in Southport as being something directly designed to be used almost as a sort of lifting point, a bouncing off point for the riots that we've seen in this country, as a way of whipping up tension and hostility on the streets of Britain?
Yeah, I mean, I think bear in mind that Britain is probably Ukraine's strongest ally and is really material in terms of Ukraine's ability to fight Russia in the East, particularly. And so, yes, they'll be looking at things like that. I think it would be far-fetched to think that an incident like Southport was manufactured by a foreign power. However, the foreign power might well be looking at trigger incidents in which they can exploit situations that occur spontaneously in order to create a bigger political effect. And I suspect that may have been happening here. One of the theories that has been going around is that Russia was indeed planning to destabilize the UK and look for excuses to do so, and that was planned for this summer prior to an expected October general election. And of course,
so there we go. Christopher Steele, in effect, doing exactly what David Clues and others have been pilloried for, and in some cases arrested for, which is to report on things that people are saying. Steele there talking about rumours effectively sort of on the wind. And yet he can do that. The Times Radio has no issue doing that. So it is very much a case of rules for thee, but not for me. Now, I'd just like to finish up by saying that if you want to know more about this, Christopher Steele in particular, who has been sort of scrutinised by UK Column over the years, there are two recent articles that I should draw attention to. First of all, on the Integrity Initiative, an article written by Mike Robinson back in 2018, and then Johnny Vedmore with a piece entitled Pablo Miller, The People Working Alongside the Real James Bond. So that's where this segment gets to, but in effect, an absolutely appallingly disproportionate response by the state. And of course, as Brian has said many times on the news in the last few weeks, an absolutely enormous and deliberate distraction from the underlying causes of the unrest in the first place.
Charles, thank you very much for that excellent summary. We're in troubled times, aren't we, with a government which is, it's got the veneer of respectability. It claims to be there as a Labour Party looking after the people, but everything it has done so far in this very short time in government is to close things down on the public, and particularly any of the public that dare to ask questions. Meanwhile, we've got the BBC absolutely able to do what it pleases on a multi-billion-pound budget. Vanessa, welcome to UK Column News. And you're going to take us through BBC fake news before getting into some of the horrors that, of course, that the BBC just doesn't or will not report.
Yes, I mean, you know, the BBC is infamous for, particularly, as you've mentioned many times before, it's BBC Media Action, basically an infiltration tool into countries like Syria, that after the scouting done by BBC Media Action would then be basically targeted for regime change and destabilisation. We've covered this a number of times. But this is actually on the BBC World News website. The report was generated by BBC Persia, which is known by most Iranians to be, let's say, the flagship of the propaganda that is being waged against Iran. And of course, one of the mainstays of that propaganda is the head covering rule. They always call it a hijab. You don't have to wear a hijab in Iran. I spent 2 weeks there about 2 years ago in Tehran and in a number of other cities, and the headscarf rule is simply that, just cover your head. You don't have to wear a veil. You don't have to wear even a full hijab of any description. And I have to say that I didn't see any morality police. And the majority of women in Tehran, in particular, in many of, let's say, the wealthier areas, but also in the markets and the souks, were not wearing any kind of head covering. But the BBC has put out this quite incredible headline for me: Iranian woman paralyzed after being shot over hijab. Over hijab, I should have underlined this. And then let's have a look at the actual report. So this was reported by Bahram Gobadi, who's actually based in the UK when you look at his X account, formerly with Reuters, now with BBC Persian. So a mother of two has been left paraplegic, according to the BBC, after being shot by Iranian police over an alleged violation of the country's strict hijab rules. A source with knowledge of the case has told the BBC. How many times have we seen BBC and legacy media reports using these anonymous sources to basically back up the mainstay propaganda against a target nation? And of course, this is coming in at a time that Iran is, if you like, center stage with the potential of escalation between Israel and Iran after the assassination of the Hamas chief negotiator, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran 2 weeks ago. So let's have a look at what the actual police report said. Unfortunately, I've only got it in Persian, but basically a number of activists went immediately onto X to say that that's literally not true. She was inside a fully tinted glass windows car and ignored an anti-theft halt. So the police believed the car was stolen and then tried to escape. When you actually read the police report itself, they talk about the fact that she ran through red lights, she ran through police stops, and bear in mind, they couldn't see who was actually in the car. So when they got to her, she was injured. In the police report itself, it doesn't actually mention any shooting. So potentially she was injured simply through damage to the car or crashing the car. It has literally nothing to do with her hijab. That's the very important point here. And, you know, even if there is some question over this, the BBC is not reflecting that question. The headline is very unambiguous. It deliberately gravitates towards this having something to do with the head covering, which actually it really doesn't, according to information that I've received. And there's no verification, there's no substantiation. So, you know, this is the rigorous journalism, as I've been told multiple times by the BBC when they question my narratives from inside Syria, that the BBC is constantly boasting of. I'll leave people to make up their own minds whether they consider the BBC to be fit for purpose or not.
I'll just come back to you, Vanessa. Of course, I remember very well a couple of years ago the BBC pumping articles out about the wearing of hijabs in Iran, and we tackled the BBC at the time and said that basically their reports were inflammatory and inaccurate. And of course, eventually the BBC just simply refused to answer. But to us, it was very clear that the agenda of the BBC was to use the hijab as a wedge to start unrest in Iranian society. And of course, that mirrors exactly BBC media action working inside Syria to engage those who were challenging the government. So it's terrible times when you have a multi-billion-pound media organisation funded by the taxpayer that is then going to effectively tell lies to the people paying for it. But take us on through really sad things that have been happening in the Middle East over the last couple of days.
Yeah, so, you know, focus again on the ongoing almost 10-month genocide in Gaza and the occupied territories by the Zionist forces. So on August the 10th, day 309 of the war, there were actually 2 attacks on schools which were housing displaced refugees from other areas of Gaza that had fled to these schools for shelter. And of course, they were told these were safe places. But we're going to focus on what has been called the Al-Fajr massacre, which is the dawn prayers for Muslims, which resulted in over 100 people being killed. When Israeli forces targeted the At-Tabayin school in Gaza City during dawn prayers. More than 200 people were injured. The school, sheltering thousands of displaced individuals, was hit while people were praying, leading to extensive casualties and devastation. And we're just going to show a very short video. It's not particularly distressing, but it will just show the school itself, and how tightly packed the school was with civilians, and of course the majority again being women and children when it was targeted by Israeli airplanes. Now, it has been reported by the Gaza Civil Defense that the Israeli army used 3 bombs weighing 2,000 pounds each. So these are the Mk-84 US supplied bombs that are designed to basically destroy armored vehicles. And 3 of these, so that's I think 907 kilos per bomb, designed to basically shatter armored vehicles and tanks, was dropped on these thousands of displaced unarmed refugees. You can imagine the absolute devastation. And in fact, it was so great, it was so horrendous. Bodies were literally torn apart. If we look at the next report, every 70 kilograms of remains of body parts is considered a martyr. What does this actually mean? Because the rescue teams couldn't identify many of the human remains collected due to the intensity of the bombing, the doctors at the Baptist hospital were not able to identify each martyr individually. Instead, the doctors have started collecting body parts in plastic bags in giving 70 kilos of remains to the family of a martyr who's gone missing. Just let that sink in for a second. You don't receive the body of your dead child or your dead father, mother, brother, sister. You receive body parts that weigh 70 kilos. And there was a young man from Gaza who went on Twitter to express what this means to the people of Gaza. So on the left, I apologize, you do see the bags that are being produced with the body parts. So he actually said, we are no longer numbers, we are approximate numbers. Absolutely horrifying. How do the Zionist forces justify this kind of heinous massacre? Well, in the Jerusalem Post article, the IDF has basically said is that they were targeting terrorists that were taking shelter in the school. In this one article, they have named multiple so-called terrorists. They named 12 more terrorists killed in Gaza school strike. No answer on the civilians. Well, let's see how truthful those claims are. This was an article in Press TV. Living on Lies, Israeli claim of killing Hamas members at the Gaza City school debunked. And then let's have a look at the actual content of the article, which focuses in one part on Rami Abdu, chairman of Euromed Monitor, human rights organization that investigates the crimes of the Israeli forces in Gaza, said 4 of the victims singled out by the Israeli military as Hamas members were from the Jabari family, whom he knew personally. They never engaged in any political or military activities. Another one was my neighbor from the Habib family who had a serious dispute with Hamas, he noted. Another civilian, Abdu Sad, was Abdul Karim Hamad, a devout man who sympathized with Hamas but had never joined its ranks. So he basically says the Israeli regime lives on lies. And if you go to his Twitter account or his X account, you can see a number of names singled out, demonstrating the lies of the Zionist entity having carried out, one of the worst massacres, but we're seeing massacre after massacre. And the following video is actually taken from the Euromed Monitor website and X account, and that just shows a section of their investigation into this massacre, and it basically goes into great detail in the lies that are being produced by the Zionist forces. And there's another actual X post where they produce all the names, particularly of the children that were killed in this attack.
Okay, Vanessa, thank you very much for that report. It is absolutely tragic what is going on. It's horrific and it's tragic what is going on. For me, for Israel to claim that it knows the identities of people in the very buildings is just incredible. You may know some, you may know 1 or 2, but to be able to say we knew exactly who was in that building in the prevailing conditions is just, to me, an incredible claim, just incredible. We need to stop it. I think the really sad thing is that we're not seeing any numbers of politicians in the UK or the US or indeed Europe-wide who are calling for an end to the violence. What we seem to have is more and more calls for more weapons and munitions to go into Israel. And of course, those supplies are led by the US and the UK. They need to be stopped. Well, we're going to say to our audience today, thank you very much for joining us. And of course, we are only able to do this by the support of our paying members. A membership of £5 a month is part of the small sum that keeps UK Column as a whole going. And our intention for the future is, despite everything that Mr. Starmer is trying to do, our intention is to expand the UK Column and to expand reporting about what is actually happening in the United Kingdom and worldwide. You can help us, of course, by sharing material. We're putting it out across the major platforms. Facebook at the moment is effectively shadow banning us, so we'll just cross that one off the list. But we're working to see whether that actually can be restored. Anybody can help us by making a purchase from the UK Column shop, and anything you buy is of help to us. So if you haven't been there before, please consider doing that. We'll also encourage our viewers and listeners to buy a copy of the Agenda 21 Your Life in Their Hands booklet. Many people have bought this. They have given us lots of complimentary responses about the content, the detail and the style, and this is encouraging us to produce different editions in the coming months, and we'll tell you more about that in due course. Now, an interview. I think this one is yours, Charles. Alistair Williams.
Indeed, yes. So I'd really encourage you to listen to Alistair Williams, who gives a fascinating personal insight into his career in comedy, but also how the scales fell from his eyes when he realised that, in effect, the entire system was controlled, but also, very interestingly, how comedy is used as a weapon with which to control and shape the agenda. And then he goes on to discuss his effectively deep Christian beliefs and how that's affected great change in him. So I'd really encourage you to listen to that.
Okay, and you've got a couple of adverts here: Died Suddenly and The Attack on Food and Farmers.
That's right, yes. Died Suddenly is to be an art exhibition in London in November, and if you're interested in helping with that, or you've got any information, then please get in touch with Jake Fern at jakehfern@yahoo.co.uk. But it's specifically to do with the excess death situation in the UK and how it has not been addressed. And yes, as Brian says, then in September, on the 6th and 7th of September, there's to be a symposium run by or hosted by Children's Health Defence, so chd.tv, Attack on Food and Farmers and How to Fight Back. So essentially how to take control of your food supply, and a range of amazing speakers. So I think you'd learn a lot there. So I would encourage you to take part in that.
Okay, and also we'll give people a reminder of the UK On Location event in Bristol on the 19th of October, 2024. And early bird tickets are still available for that at a discount. So that's an attractive option. But what do we want to do? Well, obviously we want a very good and an exciting event, but we, the UK Column team, also want to be able to meet members of our audience. And this is a very important thing for us, meeting people in person, sharing stories, and also coming together in order to discuss and report what's happening in the world. Now, Charles, let's bring you back, because you are going to be talking about food security, which should be an important issue for all of us.
That's right, Brian. Yeah, I mean, it is a very important issue. Now, I was hoping to be able to have a certain amount of statistical information on harvests in UK, having reported earlier in the year that the outlook was looking dismal. Unfortunately, it takes an age to get hold of such statistics, but the mood seems to be that wheat harvest probably down about 15%. But of course, that's on very low planting in the first place. So we'll see on that. But significantly, the government recently have announced that they're going to conduct a rapid review to meet the Environment Act target. So straight away, their priority seems to be the environment and not farming. And I do make that distinction specifically because, in effect, there should be no need for it to be a binary choice. It should be possible to improve both at the same time. But that seems to be something the government is unwilling to do, because it means banging heads with industry, which of course controls government. But nonetheless, from this, we see on the next slide just the text of, I mean, sort of banal really, but engagement with stakeholders across the environment, nature, farming resources, waste and water sectors working hand in glove with businesses, local authorities and civil society across the country to develop new ambitious plans to save nature. So here we go again, banging the same drum. Everything's going to die, everyone's going to die, and it's all your fault. But in order to address the problem, we'll put an enormous number of people in the same room and expect to come out with one sensible solution. Very unlikely to work. But the point is, as I say, that the government seem to be suggesting that it's either nature or food and not both. Of course, there is a way in which farming and nature can work absolutely hand in hand. And I'd encourage you to listen to interviews with both Julian Rose and Angus McIntosh on the UK Column website. And there are a few more in the pipeline on exactly that subject. So the other thing that's come out recently is horticulture statistics from last year. So I should qualify, this is 2023. But given that food security is all about being able to produce food for the people that are in the country at the time, so therefore the right amount of food for that number of people, but also access to it in terms of cost. That is what food security is. How are we really addressing it? So statistics last year, and this is, as I say, just horticulture, but vegetables down nearly 5%, and the area used for vegetables down over 100,000 hectares, 6.5%. Fruit grown down 12%, the area down 32,000 hectares. Import of vegetables up last year by 13%, fruit up by 3.5%, and the export of vegetables was down by 22%, and fruit was down 4%. So obviously, economic consequences to the lack of export or the reduction in export, but the significant detail is at the bottom, which is that there's a 10% increase in the value of home-produced vegetables. So effectively, a smaller area to produce, fewer vegetables and fruits coming out of the ground, but greater revenue received as a total of the amount that was grown. So that just gives an idea of what's being called inflation. Now, there's not time to sort of go into exactly why that has been caused and whether it's genuine or artificial. The next slide just shows a chart to show the effective trend in horticulture. This government, the previous government, had put out measures to have a serious uplift in horticulture, but they're not really talking about using the same amount of land. They're talking about food grown under stress conditions indoors and effectively producing fruit and vegetables in conditions that are not natural and call into question the whole idea of human health, and particular the bioavailability of any of the nutrients within the food produced. And as I say, the population, of course, is what makes food security secure or not. Now, are we anywhere near that? So the government have recently produced statistics last month, which we'll just look at on the screen now. The changing population produced on the 16th of July. And from it, if we just click on one, that they are very keen to avoid taking any responsibility for what's happening. So they say that the population is growing and is projected to reach 70 million in 2026. Well, that's quite soon. The population is also aging, and these factors will strain public services. Well, okay, fine. But if we go on to the next slide, we'll see the chart, which shows, of course, that there is a significant increase in population, but that is because, circled there at the top right, net migration is projected to add around 300,000 people each year in the long term. And they say in about a decade's time, natural change may become negative. Now, by natural change, they mean the difference between the birth and death rate, and that's projected to dip, yet they're still saying that an average of 300,000 people per year, which of course would be a reduction on last year's statistics in terms of migration. So food security cannot be considered in simple yield of produce from the UK. The population has to be taken into account. This seems to be something the government absolutely refuses to do. And of course, by putting the supposed environmental concerns first, it's very easy to see how food security is actually going to become more of a food scarcity issue. So we'll absolutely see where this goes as the harvest concludes for this year and we look towards autumn and winter.
Charles, there can be no doubt, putting this to a question as a question to you, but there can be no doubt that the government is deceiving the public over its true agenda. The figures are produced in one form to lead us in one direction. We're saving the planet, but the real agenda is an underlying agenda which isn't fully declared to the public. Absolutely.
And I mean, this is what we've seen very much over the course of this year in particular. And actually, one thing I could have mentioned was the enormous confusion that DEFRA put out the SFI, Sustainable Farming Incentive initiatives basically all the new schemes. I think there are 470 new forms that could be considered by farmers who want to do this. And what they've changed is the ability to just roll one thing on to the next year. So they are bamboozling, exactly as you say, and they are very much saying one thing and doing completely another. And this is now part of the course, but this insistence that we must do something about the environment, but effectively the bluff in suggesting that all of these environmental measures will not affect food security. Of course they will.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, Vanessa, let's bring you back in, and you're going to be talking to us about escalation effectively in the Middle East. What are you seeing?
So yeah, I mean, we're still seeing escalation in the region, albeit it's we haven't yet had the response from the resistance factions, of course, led by Iran. But we've seen a lot of movement from the United States to, of course, bolster its defenses for its partner in crime in Israel. So Defense Minister Austin orders additional naval assets to the Middle East amid rising tensions. He's ordered additional naval assets, which include the USS Georgia submarine, and he's told the USS Abraham Lincoln, which is an aircraft carrier strike group, to get a move on. Basically, if we have a look at the text of the article itself, that basically confirms what I've said. The order came following a phone call on Sunday. So Sunday, the day that they bombed the school in Gaza and massacred 100 civilians and injuring terribly 200 others. So a conversation between Austin and the Israeli Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant. Austin reiterated the US commitment to taking every possible step to defend Israel, not to keep peace in the region, exactly the same situation as in Ukraine. Noted the strengthening of US military force posture and capabilities throughout the Middle East in light of hostile regional tensions. Again, I have to remark that it's quite incredible the pressure that is being put on Iran to back down, and yet absolutely no pressure on Israel. In fact, there is total endorsement of Israel's crimes in carrying out its aggression against Beirut and against Tehran. We're living in extraordinary times. So let's have a look again at the US naval hardware that is already in the region. Again, Brian, you might know better than I, but I don't remember seeing such a deployment of US naval battalions and of course allied battalions for a foreign entity, for a foreign nation.
Well, I'll just say, Vanessa, that yes, it is unusual for two carrier groups to be brought in relatively close proximity to each other. So these are massive forces. And to put a scale to it for our viewers and listeners, one of these aircraft carriers virtually carrying more aircraft than the average national air force of many countries. So these are immensely powerful assets. And of course, they've got the group of ships with them to provide air and missile defense to the carrier. But the other thing I'm going to say is the reality is, however, that even these units do not have any defense against the latest Russian hypersonic missiles. So there's a game of Russian roulette. A pun, I know, but I've used the expression underway here, because at the end of the day, should Russia decide to use its latest weapons, then even these American carrier groups are vulnerable.
Yeah, and let's remember that even Ansarullah, even the Yemeni forces, managed to actually strike, was at the Theodore Roosevelt. So, I mean, none of them are impervious to the resistance missiles, including Iran's developed ballistic and cruise missiles, and even potentially Yemen, Iraq, etc. But let's have a look what else the US is providing to what is effectively declared a genocidal entity. So 3.5 billion more in immediate military aid to Israel amid the war in Gaza. But also in the last 24 hours, America has pledged a further 20 billion. I think it's around 5 arms packages to Israel. So again, extraordinary funding and sponsorship of this ethno-supremacist entity. Then let's have a look at an opinion piece in Haaretz, which again, it's Israeli-based media. Netanyahu wants a world war. So what is the author saying? Let's have a look. He's basically saying, so he's talking about the fact that in April, Netanyahu had orchestrated a situation where the US was mobilized alongside its World War II allies, France and Britain, together with moderate Sunni states, which of course include Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, etc., into a coalition defending Israel. So this was when Israel had targeted the Iranian consulate in Damascus. This is Netanyahu's dream come true, the world in an uproar with Israel at the epicenter. And I do think that this sort of bleeds into many more issues that we're looking at. The results of Haniyeh's assassination in Tehran are even more impressive as far as Netanyahu is concerned. Biden sent a force to the region that dwarfs the contingent sent in April. Netanyahu is setting the agenda. The world is breaking up around him. His actions are keeping Vladimir Putin, too, from his slumber. He's more relevant than ever on the global stage, and Netanyahu prevents the end of the war in Gaza in order to ignite a world war. In his megalomaniac hallucinations, this world war, the victory of civilization over the barbarians, shall be his legacy. And of course, where I would comment here is if Netanyahu were to leave tomorrow, actually this agenda would continue. It might take a slightly different shape, it might take a slightly different optic, but the dominance of the far-right extremism and Netanyahu's type of expansionism and revisionist Zionism is an ideology held by the majority of Israelis. And in fact, if we look at the next video, which is of the chief of one of the settler unions, I guess you'd call it, Daniela Weiss, who's been operating alongside the various Zionist governments since the 1970s, where she partnered Ariel Sharon to effectively ensure that the settlements stole as much Palestinian territory as possible. We've played a video with her in it before, so I've included just a few seconds of the original video we played and a recent TV interview where she talks about the fact that the settlers will be in Gaza. In other words, it's going to be a copy-paste of what happened in the West Bank will then be carried out in Gaza.
This land was promised to the Jews by God.
אז לאן זה הולך לדעתך האירוע שלנו ברצועת עזה?
לאן זה הולך?
כן.
לדעתי, תוך פחות משנה, יהיו אזרחים יושבים בעזה.
למה את חושבת?
מכיוון שיש לי איזושהי תחושה של הריתמוס ההיסטורי, ברגע שראש הממשלה נתניהו אמר שתהיה נוכחות צבאית ממושכת, אמרתי זהו, ככה זו הזמנה למחול. והוא עשה לנו ממש הזמנה למחול. אני נשאר, ואתם תשתמשו בניסיון, אני קוראת לזה העתק הדבק. מה שעשינו ביהודה ושומרון, וגם
אבל מה יהיה עם כל הערבים?
And we've mentioned the fact that, in fact, Netanyahu is doing nothing to bring back the hostages. We know now that Hamas, under the leadership of Yahya Sinwar, has actually pulled out of the negotiations on Thursday, saying that Netanyahu, instead of agreeing to the agreement that was set by Biden on the 2nd of July, he's introduced new measures that he knows perfectly well Hamas are going to refuse, which means that the ceasefire agreement will be delayed yet again. I mean, this is what has been going on since October the 7th, and that Netanyahu and the Zionist forces can continue their ethnic cleansing in the whole of Palestine. The next video, again, I just want to bring in Alistair Kursk, former diplomat, who goes on interview with Judge Napolitano every Monday, and it's well worth watching because I think his analysis of the region is among the best. And here he's talking about why he believes a regional war is inevitable.
Fair to say, Netanyahu does not want a ceasefire and does not want a deal to return the hostages. He wants a wider war against Iran.
That's obvious, yeah, quite clear. He's made that absolutely apparent. There's not a single doubt about that amongst Israelis. He wants a full war, and he wants to provoke it, and that's why the great danger is, as I say, not just what Iran does whenever it does it in this next period, but might be much more threatening than people expect. I know the sort of myth of Israeli military greatness is pervasive, but it may be much more serious than they expect. And then they will react. And what will they do to provoke it to the next level where America is fully engaged? Use a tactical nuclear weapon? That's been threatened by Israel, something like that. Well, that will certainly take us to a different level. Where will it leave Russia and China? I mean, this is why I say it seems to me almost inevitable, because there's no one actually pulling back, actually.
And then finally, I just want to play a video from 2019 with Syed Mohammed Marandi, a professor in Tehran University. I'm sure everybody knows him. He's a regular guest on the BBC and Channel 4, pushing back against their propaganda. But here he talks about what will happen in the case of a regional escalation, what will happen to the Persian Gulf, and what will happen to the oil installations there, and how that will disastrously impact upon particularly Western economy. And of course, that's a repeat of the Ukraine playbook and the Nord Stream sabotage.
They cannot win a war in the Persian Gulf. Anyone who looks at the map knows that from the northern tip to the southern tip of the Persian Gulf, Iran has a strong presence. And it is a small gulf or waterway, the Persian Gulf. The oil and gas facilities are impossible to protect. If there is war, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz would be a sideshow. That would be nothing in comparison to the complete and utter destruction of all the oil and gas facilities in the Persian Gulf, as well as all the tankers.
Okay, Vanessa, thank you very much for that section. Many people saying we're moving very quickly towards World War III. Isn't that an incredible statement? But for me, what is really incredible is we are not seeing a clamor of politicians throughout the world to wind back on this violence, both in Ukraine and the Middle East, in order to get the world back on a stable, peaceful footing. We seem to have people that want nothing but war. And what is so terribly sad, I think, for the US is that the wealth of America, a great nation, is simply being poured into weapons and munitions on the battlefield with no clear-cut idea of what the result is going to be of the use of those weapons. So I think there needs to be massive reflection by the voting public in the West, and certainly our politicians need to be held to account as to what's happening at the moment. Now, is it just the politicians, or is it also other agencies that are causing the problem? Well, I just, in this segment for today's news, want to give recognition to Brian Malet, former Marine, who's been giving some really good analysis about Ukraine, amongst other regions of the world. That's for the New Atlas, if you want to go and find him on YouTube. But one of the things that he's consistently pointed to when talking about Ukraine is the work of the RAND Corporation, and this particular document from 2019, overextending and unbalancing Russia, assessing the impact of cost-imposing options. And if we just have, this is only from the front cover, but essentially It's saying that this brief, the RAND brief, summarizes a report that comprehensively examines non-violent, cost-imposing options that the United States and its allies could pursue across economic, political, and military areas to stress, overextend, and unbalance Russia's economy and armed forces and the regime's political standing at home and abroad. This is a plan to attack Russia, not in an overt military sense directly, but to attack Russia's identity and their government and their society and the military by using covert, semi-covert, and proxy means. And of course, what have they achieved? Well, the section in this report says very clearly that part of the measures should be providing lethal aid to Ukraine. And my goodness, how they have done that, because based on this advice, Ukraine has raised 3 armies, 2 of those armies already destroyed, the 3rd presently being destroyed in the battle with Russia. But surprising that the RAND Corporation was advising this as a good policy, as a sensible policy for the US government. And if we follow on through, this is just another little excerpt from this document. We've got the ideological and informational cost-imposing measures. And if you read this section, what it actually is an attack on the whole structure of the Russian government and society. This is subversion, although the word subversion isn't used, but nevertheless, the RAND Corporation was using its influence as a think tank in order to give the US government in particular, these options in order to attack and undermine Russia. And look at the vile killing that this has unleashed. In the bottom left corner, you've got one of the RAND spokesmen introducing a recent meeting that they had where they were talking about the whole crisis in Ukraine and how it was going to continue for a very long time. But also, this caught my eye that they were working alongside the Polish Institute of International Affairs. And when I looked deeper into the Polish organization, I found that in addition to talking about the situation in Ukraine, they were also analysing what was going on inside UK politics. And here you can see on the right of your screen part of a bulletin report that says support for, quote, anti-establishment parties is rising in Britain. And if you actually get into this incredible document, what it actually starts to talk about is the fact that for politics in Britain to work properly, the major parties, the Labour and the Conservative Party, should get at least 80% of the vote. And if they did get this percentage, then democracy would be working properly in the UK. But because we have individuals and small parties now attempting to challenge the warmongering, for example, of the UK government, this Polish organisation is branding the smaller parties such as Reform, but also the Greens and the Muslim Voice as being anti-establishment. I found this an incredible piece of text because to me it shows hostile intent by Poland and the intent to interfere into UK politics. Charles, I'll just ask you to respond to that briefly, but these think tanks are immensely dangerous in the way that they're playing fast and loose with the whole democracy, the government structure, the constitutions of nation states.
I think so. I mean, I think really they're leaping an enormous obstacle, a factual obstacle, which causes the degree to which people are engaged in the first place. When they talk about, you refer to the share of the vote. I mean, are they talking about all the people that are eligible to vote or all the people that do actually vote? Because, of course, we've gone quite far beyond that now in this country, in that voter turnout is low, and we look at the result, the completely skewed result now that the Labour government returned, in that they took a share of the vote by head, by number, that was far, far smaller than, for example, Jeremy Corbyn took years ago. And yes, of course, they are by far and away the dominant entity in Parliament with over 400 seats. So, I mean, there are so many issues at stake. But yes, I mean, the line that they take, is absolutely sort of symptomatic of the well, I mean, I would say meddling, but I mean, everyone gets accused of meddling these days. But the interference, at least in terms of ideologically interfering with how our democracy should function. I mean, it's quite clear it doesn't function, but whether or not we need pointers from elsewhere and entities that sit outside of government is open to debate.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, just to follow through on this section, a little bit of a deeper look at RAND. We have, of course, RAND being a US-based think tank, but RAND Europe also exists with an office in UK. What caught my attention here is right at the bottom, you see that it's talking about carrying out work on behalf of public and private clients, foundations, and international organizations like the European Commission. So I'm going to suggest that if there's one thing this organization is not, and that is unbiased, it's clearly biased in who it's working for and the policies that it's putting out. This was a picture from one of their videos, just to give you an indication of the audience in what would look like a rather impressive formal address. But it appears that the audience are in some form of tin shed or hangar. The gentleman on the right is Polish military general who's been brought in to talk about the war in Ukraine. But if we have a look at what the RAND Corporation is up to, one of the things it's doing, of course, is sucking in young people to train them as its graduates, and no doubt to impart on those young people its views and values of the world. Here's some history about the Pardee RAND Graduate School. And it's saying that in the past 50 years, more than 500 alumni have graduated from Pardee RAND with the theoretical and applied skills that enable them to tackle hard issues around the globe. And if you look at the final sentence, it says, and perhaps most importantly, our alumni are making a difference and changing the world. Of course, it doesn't say how that change is actually taking place. But this also caught my eye because they've been working on how the Israeli Defense Force could actually deal with the fact it cannot bring sufficient men into the army in order to deal with the situations which Israel faces. And so what RAND was talking about was a particular system of conscription, which meant that the Israeli government could take the pick of young men, and those that it didn't choose could go on to do some role in civil society. And I just thought this was an amazing coincidence with the scheme that we had the Tory government putting forward just before we lost our illustrious Prime Minister. So I'll leave our audience to think about that. But this one also caught my eye, using social media data to nowcast migration around the globe. And when we got into the RAND article, it was using the phrase stocks of migrants, which I found extremely offensive. And as I've put on screen, by stocks of migrants, are they talking about livestock? I better just leave it there because I found that so horrific. But this was the last thing, which was that basically this was one of the articles. The Iran-Israel war is just getting started. And the label to this photo says the apparent remains of an Iranian missile lie in the desert near the southern city of Arad, Israel, April 24, 2024. And I just found this an incredible image because if you look at the two figures at the bottom of the screen, they have see-through shadows, which you can see very clearly if you zoom in. But the individual who's walking away to the left has an extremely dark shadow, but you notice that that shadow cuts off where the object is, and there is no shadow on the object itself. My conclusion is that this is a fake photograph, but it's being put out by RAND as obviously truthful material. So a few questions to be asked there. Let's end by coming back to you, Charles, because basically the subject is economic inactivity in the United Kingdom.
It is. Thank you, Brian. Yes, this is from the NHS Confederation, published this summer, 25th of June. And really what they're pointing out, I mean, well, first of all, economic inactivity encompasses all those people who, for one reason or another, are not part of the UK labour market. They're not part of the workforce. But the specific trend here is long-term sickness. And this is what sort of is being discussed. Now, it is really euphemistic for the time period covered by the largest pharmaceutical trial ever conducted. It does overlap exactly with it. So we'll just look at what some of the text from this thing from the NHS Confederation. They say, following an historic low prior to the pandemic, the number of people out of the workforce in the UK has risen by 900,000. There are now 2.8 million economically inactive, long-term sick, about a third of the total inactive population. Now, this is absolutely considerable, and the degree to which it correlates with changes imposed by government, either via enforced internments or indeed effectively mandated pharmaceutical products, is significant. So that's not to be ignored. The next slide shows a graph indicating not just the degree to which long-term sickness has gone up, you see on the right 85%, but also how the fracturing of our way of life and in particular the family unit has taken hold. And we see that there's been a 32% decrease in the number of those who are economically inactive because they are looking after their family or looking after their home. And I think that's, again, another very significant factor, which has accelerated hugely after 2020, where there was a very deliberate push to affect the way that society would behave, not just then, but also in the future. And again, further graphs illustrate the effect on the working age population. Now, these are supposed to show effectively comorbidities, so the numbers of different conditions that people have, with the darker line at the top representing people who have 5 or more health conditions that are known about. Of course, there are going to be a lot of people that presumably are not captured by this data because they're not known about. Most alarming, I would say, on the left-hand side is the younger age group, 16 to 24, and you can see a dotted line before 2020. So this is a trend that has been in the pipeline, accelerated, no doubt, by the factors I've just mentioned. But it is very alarming to think that people who should be in the prime of their life are being affected in such a manner that they are prevented from working or choosing not to work. So I don't want to make assumptions that people are not joining the workforce because they are unable to, and long-term sickness itself is a definition that should be open to some considerable scrutiny, given the way that it's possible to manipulate the benefit system in the UK and, of course, survive. Although, of course, I'm not in any way dismissing genuine sickness. Now, we'll just look at what the Labour Party said about this, and I think quite a telling statement. They talk about the NHS becoming not just a sickness service, but to prevent ill health in the first place. And they say that they must reflect, tellingly, that it must also reflect the change in the nature of disease, with a greater focus on the management of chronic long-term conditions. Okay, so they're addressing what is happening, but certainly not what has caused it to happen. And I think that phrase, change in the nature of disease, is very, very significant when, again, one considers the pharmaceutical products that have been, in effect, enforced upon people over the last 4 years. So sort of concurrent with this, we see this relentless push towards the suggestion that ill health is normal, chronic ill health is normal. And further, in the next slide, we look at terminal illness, and we've got the change, and this was specifically with regard to the benefit systems, but the way in which that ill health and terminal illness is being looked at. So Disability Rights UK, pointing out the definition of terminally ill has been changed. The next slide showed us that in 2023, for the purposes of these benefits, to be terminally ill, you were either suffering from a progressive disease, and your death as a result of that disease can reasonably be expected within 12 months. Well, this is going to capture an awful lot of people if of course, the suggestion is that it is progressive and there's nothing that can be done about it. So it is an ill health service, but it's very much normalizing this idea that people are going to be draining resources. This is something that Mike Robinson talked about the other day, and specifically the article that Matthew Paris had published about this, about effectively warming people up to the idea that they mustn't be a burden on society, they mustn't be a burden on their family. And I refer back to the graph earlier showing the decrease in the number of people who are taking time to look after family members. And all this gets wrapped up. And of course, the next thing we then look at is the assisted dying bill, which is come back. You know, this has been on the cards since Lord Faulkner first dealt with it years ago. And we see again, it was debated back in July, 26th of July of this year. So there is a relentless push towards this. And then, of course, the other thing that we have to be mindful of is the way that all this is reported in terms of the government managing the statistics, in particular, where it concerns death. So this is the chart showing the total deaths from the Office of National Statistics, just released yesterday. And we've talked about this a lot before, but it must be pointed out again that the dotted line that runs either sort of along the top of or just above or just below the bars of the chart is what's called the expected death sort of predictor. So this was changed. It used to be the 5-year average, and it's now written down as expected deaths. Now, what I've done is put a red line across the graph to make it slightly more obvious that, in effect, this is absolute manipulation of statistics in order for the government to be able to try to convince the population that there isn't a problem. And if you look at July 2023, which is roughly in the middle of the chart, so approximately a year ago, you can see quite clearly when you look towards on the right towards 2024, the expected death tally has been increased enormously, but no good reason given for this. So, as I say, this whole idea that that death, or at least chronic illness, is becoming normal, and indeed that assisted dying and all the rest of it should very much become part of the way of things, but at the same time is suggesting that people aren't dying in huge numbers for reasons that are unknown. And I'll just close out this segment by talking about something that actually came through the post the day before yesterday. So actually, I don't know if we can just go back one, because it just the image first of all. Oh well, never mind. But basically, it's the Royal Mail have partnered with something called Pharmacy to You, and this is to enable prescription drugs to be delivered without anyone having to do anything. And the key bit of text from this advert, which has been put all over the place to encourage people to take it up, is it says, simply register and order your prescription through our website or the Royal Mail Health app. We'll then deliver it safely and securely for free. So those key words, safe and secure. And then, of course, it's free. Well, we've heard all that before with many, many other things. Register below and we'll take care of the rest. We'll even send handy reminders so you never run out. It's as easy as that. So again, this is something that Debbie Evans has talked about a lot, the way in which the delivery of what's being called health, but isn't, is being affected by technology and continuing to isolate people, keeping them in their homes with absolutely no review as to whether they require these drugs or not, but they are simply going to have them forced into their homes effectively by suggesting that it's all too easy and it's safe and secure, like so many other things. So a gloomy outlook, really, in terms of health or sickness, but certainly in terms of the way in which the economy is likely to go as a result of this. And again, the thing to keep our eye on really is where this ends up with assisted dying.
Charles, thank you for that. A heavy subject, particularly to end today's news on, but this is the reality of what's happening in this country, and the wider public need to know about it. And I am just going to say, for many people who now realise the very serious things happening in this country, some people are finding it almost overwhelming as all of these very dark agendas come in, that taking simple actions can make such a difference. So if you're somebody who has never emailed your MP or challenged a local councillor or attended a local meeting, if you do this, and take action to challenge what is actually happening around you, we say that you will feel better. We certainly did in the early days. And of course, if you can make friends of other like-minded people so that you go with other people to challenge the system and its flawed agenda, you will feel even better. So what is required is hundreds of thousands of people doing a little thing instead of a small number of people trying to do a lot. It's that simple. And we'll end by saying that, of course, the people who are falling into the trap of engaging in violence are simply helping the state in its closed down agenda. So if you want proper change out of Keir Starmer's Stasi state, find a friend and take the establishment to task in a peaceful, reasonable way. We'll end there. Vanessa, thank you very much for joining us today, as always, and to your good self, Charles. We'll end the news. It's been slightly extended news today, which hopefully is made up from our lack of a live broadcast. But I'm hoping that when I speak to the team in a moment, we might be able to do a UK column extra. So do look out for that. We'll do it if we can. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.